Good afternoon and welcome to KSK Historical Accounts. It's been a while and we have come back. Today we want to learn something interesting, something that many have difficulty with, but it's very simple. We are just going to help learners as well as teachers who have difficulty identifying which century a particular year falls in, to help themselves on ease that task. So today we are going to learn how to determine the century a year falls in. How to determine the century that a year falls in. Is it easy to do that? Yes, very easy. Very easy. But if you don't know, you will see that as a very difficult task. But it is easy. If a year is given and you want to know which century that particular year falls, how will you be able to do that? In the first place, when you say a century, in historical calculations or periodization, what is it? A century simply refers to a period of 100 years. So in historical periodization, we take centuries. So you count would see maybe the first century BC or the first century AD or what have you. So which period is that century? Or what are the years that come together to form that particular century? 100 years as a century. So 100 years, 1 to get that particular century. So if you say the first century, it will have to be given from day 1 or year 1 to the 100th year. So from day 1 or year 1 to the 100th year, then you get the first century. Then how are we going to do that? To be able to determine the first century, you know that the first century will be beginning from either year 0, which is day 1, or year 1, that's the first year, to year 100. Year 100, that is the 100th year, and that becomes the first century. If I'm given a year to determine, I should know that from the very first day or from the very first year to the 100th year, every year within falls in the first century. That is a basic everybody should know. That we have 100 years in a century, so the first 100 years is for the first century. That is basic, you should know. So having noted that, then the others becomes easy. This is a simple rule I have devised for you to use. The rule is simply that if you take the first century, which is a basic for every learner of history or everybody who would want to determine centuries or a year a century falls in, the centuries a year falls in, that person should be able to identify that the first 100 years forms the first century. But if you want to know subsequent centuries and the years that form the range of years, this is the rule. The first rule is that the first year of any century is the last year of the previous century plus 1. the first year of any century is the last year of the previous century plus 1. So assuming we want to determine the very first year in the second century, that means that we have 100, which is the last year of the first century, plus 1, which will give us 101, and that becomes the very first year in the second century, 101. So that is the first rule. Let me write it down so you take note. So the first rule says that apart from the first century, the beginning or starting year, of any century is the ending year of the previous century plus 1. So the beginning year of any century, apart from the very first century, which we have already noted that it starts from year 1 to the 100th year, or you can say day 1, just as a baby is born, and the counting of the days and years for the baby starts from the very day he or she is born. So from either day 1, or you can say year 1, first year, up to the 100th year, that's the first century, basic, everybody should know. Then after that one, every other century that you want to know, the year that forms that century, you should know the range, the beginning year and the ending year. Just as we know the beginning year here, that's year 1 up to year 100, that's the range. So if you take the second century should have a beginning year and an ending year. That's the range of years. So apart from the first one, any other century you want to determine the beginning year, it is the ending year of the previous one plus 1. So now we are taking our previous year to be the ending year of our previous century to be the 100, because our previous century here is the first century. So if you want to determine the beginning year of the second century, the ending year of the first century is 100. So you will get 100 plus 1. That gives you 101. And that is the beginning year of the second century. So example, the second century begins with 100 plus 1, 100 being the ending year of the first century, and the 1. So 100 plus 1, which will give us 101. So 101 is the beginning year of the second century. So the range now comes 101 to something, with something. That will be the next rule we will go on. Let's try another example. If you want to do another example, let's say 4th century. 4th century, if you are dealing with 4th century, it means that the immediate previous century is the 3rd century. And the ending year of the 3rd century is 300. So you just get your 300 and you add 1 to it, and it will give you 301. So the beginning year of the 4th century becomes 301. All right. Somebody will be asking the question, how did you get your 301? That is where we would be going. We are going to, in the next rule, determine how to get or determine the ending year of a century. So I hope by this simple explanation it is clear for you. I am going over the 1st century that we all know in historical calculations. It is for year 1, which includes, or you can say day 1, up to the 100th year. That's the 1st century. Every historical account you know. Then every learner of history or student of history should learn or know that basic. Apart from the 1st century, every other century, if you want to know the range, just as we have the beginning and the ending, you would have to know these rules and laws that I am bringing forth. And we have the first rule on the board, that apart from the 1st century, the beginning year of any other century is the ending year of the immediate past century plus 1. So that is the first rule. So we are determining this rule for today. So in our subsequent videos, I would take us through how to go step by step. But I want you to carefully look at this rule, and it will help you get the range. Now, 1st century ends in 100, the 100th year. So if you want the 2nd century, the year it begins, just add 1 to 100 and you get 101, and then the 2nd century begins. That is that. If you want to know the beginning year of the 4th century, which century ended before the 4th century? That is the 3rd century. The 3rd century will end in year 300. So you just add 1 to 300, you get 301, and that becomes your beginning year of the 4th century. In our subsequent video, you look at how to determine the ending year of a century, so that we get the complete range, the beginning year plus the ending year. Then we are free to go. We have another rule that can also help us determine the beginning year. You will look at all that in subsequent videos. This is KSK Historical Accounts, and we are very grateful for giving us your attention. If it's an interesting and educative channel, subscribe, share with others, and then we are free to learn a lot as far as history is concerned. Thank you. See you next time.